Good morning. Extend my welcome to you and thank you for coming here and spending your Sunday mornings with the Church of God. That you would take your Bibles and follow along. If you find something that I missay, misrepresent, or speak in an inconsistent manner, please bring it to my attention. That way we all can learn. But if you would take your Bibles and turn to Luke 18, we'll be starting there in a moment. So in our lives, have we ever met someone that just couldn't do wrong, at least in their own eyes? Someone who was always right, and even when they were wrong, well, refer to the first one, that they were still always right. Someone who was so perfect that they argued with the authorities and sought to justify themselves based upon their own righteousness, or someone that just had to be a one-upper. They had to do something above and beyond anything and everything that you brought up or that someone else brought up. They had to be the best. So I know I have, but just in case you haven't, well, let's meet them together. So Luke 18, we're going to be starting in verse 9. So Luke 18 and verse 9. It says, "He also spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves, that they were righteous and despised others. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus to himself, 'God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all I possess.' And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, 'God, be merciful to me, a sinner.' I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." This morning I want to take some time and talk about what may be labeled in our Bible as the Pharisee and the tax collector, and what some of my readings have labeled as the parable of the 2 prayers. We see Jesus, through Luke's writing, setting the stage for this parable. And with setting the stage, he tells us who he is talking to. Verses 9 and 10 says, "He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves, those who were self-righteous, who treated others with contempt." So he's telling us who he is writing to and who he is writing about. And here he begins. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Now, this was not a unheard of practice in Jerusalem. Many went up to the temple because the temple was situated on a mount. It was raised above everything else. So when it says they went up, they literally went up to a higher elevation. They went up the hill. Now this is what's classified as a very Lukean way, or presented within the style of Luke, the way he wrote it. We have here stage the set for us. Luke states up front to the parable is pointing toward those who trusted in themselves, who believed that they were righteous, and that treated others with contempt. And right out of the gate, we know who the parable is pointed at. We can picture these people in our heads, and many of us have interacted with them at various points in our lives. Some of us have that one person who has this mentality pictured in our heads, that we can see them. Again, Luke begins Jesus' dialogue with 2 men went up to the temple to pray. Again, not a common occurrence. The devoted Jew practiced daily prayer 3 times a day. 9, noon, and 3 p.m. were the times of prayer. They went up to the temple as a regular occurrence on a daily basis to pray. It would have been normal for multiple people to travel at the same time, not necessarily traveling in the same direction at the same time, really going up to the Temple Mount, as the temple was situated on a raised structure above the city that surrounded it. So the temple was raised above everything else. Many would go up to the temple during these hours because prayer was held especially efficient or successful in producing or desiring the intended results if offered at the temple. So the temple was a special place to pray. They felt that they would get more benefit, that God would hear them better if they were in the temple. Continuing on, Jesus tells us the two characters of the parable. One, a Pharisee, and the other, a tax collector. Now, thinking through this, I want to know, who is the Pharisee? Well, we know that the Pharisees were very prominent in Jesus' day. According to the Zondervan NIV Bible Dictionary, the Pharisee was one of the three prominent parties of Judaism at the time of Christ. You have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. The Pharisees were by far the most influential. That's why we hear more about them. The name Pharisee actually means the separated ones or separatists in its Semitic form. So we know that they were separated out even from the Jews, as we can see from their actions and their perceptions that we can see in the New Testament text, as they were constantly away and apart from the general people. Also known as Chassidim, which means the loved of God or loyal to God. And found throughout Palestine, they wore distinctive clothing as to be easily recognized. So someone could look at a Pharisee and instantly know that they were a Pharisee. Now, if we're going to talk about who the Pharisees were, well, let's also talk about who the tax collectors were. Simply, they worked for the Roman government. They were contracted to collect taxes or tolls from the local population of a particular area. Those who were contracted would have purchased the right to collect taxes from the Roman government. By essentially prepaying someone else's taxes, they gained the right to collect taxes from that general populace, and then above and beyond to their own profit, as to recoup the expenses from what they had already paid Rome. Now, there are two classes of tax collectors. We see one is the chief tax collector, and an example of that would be Zacchaeus, was the chief tax collector. And then you have the ordinary publican. That's another term for tax collector. They were the lowest class of servants engaged in collecting revenue. And we can see that the apostle Matthew or Levi was one of these publicans. He was one of the tax collectors. Now, they were extremely hated by the Jews, and not for wrong purposes, but they were an instrument through which the subjugation of the Jews to the Roman emperor was perpetuated. So Rome used the local Jews to collect taxes for Rome, and the Jews didn't like that. Tax collectors were noted for imposing more taxes than were required so that they might more quickly enrich themselves. So if they paid a certain amount to Rome for the taxes, but they collected more, the more was their profit. That's how they became rich. It's like if I sell you something, or if I buy something from you and then sell it to someone else at a higher price, that difference is what the tax collectors made their money off of. They were regarded as traitors and apostates, defiled by their frequent contacts with pagans and willing tools of the oppressor being Rome. They were continuing to be classified as sinners, harlots, as well as pagans. So, I think it's pretty safe to say that the Jews didn't like these people. Not in the slightest. To where that they were shunned, they were pushed out of the Jewish community because they served and worked for Rome, the oppressor. Now that we've set the stage, we know who Jesus is talking about. We also know who the two main characters are. Well, let's get into the prayers. So the Pharisees' prayers first, we see in Luke 18 and verses 11 and 12. It says, "The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. Can't you just picture this person? At least I can. Standing on top of a box or standing in front of everyone else with outstretched arms proclaiming how good he is, at least in his own eyes. Looking toward heaven and shouting his prayer for everyone to see and to hear. He is calling attention not to God, but to himself. Now, culturally at this time, prayer was either silent or uttered in a low voice. Vocal prayer, but praying too loudly was perceived as rude. We can see that in 1 Samuel 1 and 13 with Hannah's prayer. She was at the tabernacle, and she was moving her lips, being very quiet, but she was still praying in public. But can't you just see this man, this Pharisee, shouting his prayer from the housetops so that he is not only heard by God, but by those around him? Go, look at me, I'm so good. Sure, he had his virtues, and the good things he points out are things that we ought not to be doing. He did not fall into this gross sins which many have fallen. But beginning with thanksgiving in his prayer, praising God for something that he has done, but not focusing on God's sovereign work. He was religious outwardly, adhering to the ceremonies of the law. And as a Pharisee, that's what he would have been expected to do. He would have been expected to adhere to the letter of the law, but keeping the letter, but not the intent. So where did he fail? Why did Jesus use this illustration? Well, first, he lacked one vital quality. He lacked humility. Having a proud and selfish arrogance which developed into his unsympathetic nature towards others, he thought he was better than everyone else. Next, he saw that God was indebted to him, that he was owed salvation simply on the basis of the good deeds that he had done and the outward observances of the law. Now we see that he was, because of the things he brings up, he didn't do this and didn't do that, but did tithe and did fast, that I'm deserving. I did these things, right? So I should get them. But is that really the case? Continuing on, we can see that the Pharisee was self-justified. See that where he begins, says, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. He was self-justified in his own mind. He was so certain of his righteousness that he compares himself favorably to a variety of unrighteousness violators of the commandments. Because I didn't do this, therefore I am good. Well, that's part of it. But does that bring in the proper attitude? Interestingly, we see similar lists both in chapter 5 and 6 of 1 Corinthians. So the things he lists are things to shun and to run away from, to not partake of. But should we raise ourselves up? He concludes this list by directly referencing the tax collector, but in a very judgmental attitude, instantaneously making an evaluation of the man on the basis of his vocation. Because he was a tax collector, he was reviled, he was put away. Because all tax collectors, quotes, took on more taxes than they needed. They cheated those who they were taxing. Because everyone did it, this tax collector should be put down as well. And who knows? His assumptions may have been correct, given the reputation of tax collectors in general and the ones that they had earned, but he was still putting himself forward. He was still saying, I'm better because I'm better. Well, but why was he self-justified? We can see two practices that he brings up. He singles out the reasons for the Pharisees' greater righteousness. First, his fastings, and then his tithing. He says, I fast twice a week. Now, interestingly, fasting was only commanded in the Old Testament once a year. Fasting, and that was only on the Day of Atonement. There were optional fastings, and what we consider as traditional, that came twice a week. But voluntary fasting, or fasting for those who wish to gain special favor, usually occurred on Mondays and Thursdays, which I found kind of interesting. Now, those traditionally are the days that Moses went up and came down from Mount Sinai. So they had special Jewish significance and tradition. But also, they were also the market days. They were the days in which people from the country came into Jerusalem to buy and sell their goods, which meant that those who were fasting had a greater audience for them to see them, a greater audience to be seen and to see their piousness. Other Sabbaths later became traditional fasts celebrating national calamities. So there weren't more fasts declared throughout the ages, but there was still only one that was commanded in the old law. Now, fasting only involved taking bread and water, which is a very scarce diet, and it's why prisoners would sometimes be put on a bread and water diet. It wasn't pleasant. But not only was their diet changed, but they changed their appearance. They whitened their faces, they wore disheveled clothing, they made it distinctive that they were fasting. They wanted to make a show of it. Well does Isaiah confront the hypocrisy of God's people, and something that the Pharisees should have been aware of, in Isaiah 58. So Isaiah 58 and verses 3 through 7. It says, why have we fasted, and you see it not? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you take no knowledge of it? Behold, in the day of our fast, you seek your own pleasures and oppress all your workers. Behold, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to hit with a wicked fist. Fasting like yours this day will not make your voice to be heard on high. Is such the fast that I chose? A day for a person to humble himself? Is it to bow down his head like a reed and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Will you call this a fast and a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. Isaiah is chastising the Israelites well before Jesus brings this parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, but for the same reasons. They're not adhering to the purpose of the fast. They are not using it in a proper manner. But Jesus especially condemns the traditional actions of those who are fasting, specifically those to be seen by others. We can see that in Matthew 6, and verses 16 and 18, or 16 through 18. It says, moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, that they may appear to men to be fasting. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, But to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. Jesus knew that their tradition, their way of doing things, was to bring attention that they were fasting. It was another, look at me, I am fasting, I'm so pious. Well, that's not the intent of the fast. That's not the intent of what they're supposed to be doing. And Jesus condemns them for doing so. He says, do not do it to be seen of men. Now the fast that the Pharisee was doing was above and beyond the call of duty. The Pharisee wears it as a badge of achievement that should cause God to give him favor. Again, he's saying, I did this. You owe me salvation. He continues on with his thought after as I fast twice a week. The Pharisee continues, I give tithes that all I get. Now we know tithing is present throughout the Old Testament. We can see it in Leviticus 27, Numbers 18, and Deuteronomy 14. It's part of the old law. Now, growers had already given a tenth or tithe for certain produce as required by the law, but some of the Pharisees tithed food that they ate. They tithed things that they were given. Some even herbs, which was not required by the law. In Matthew 23 and verse 23, it says, Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out the gnat and swallowing the camel. Just because they tithed, they thought they were doing more righteous. They thought they were being better than the average person. But again, what is their mindset? What is their attitude in doing this? We can see that the Pharisee in this case was, look at me, I'm so good. To sum up the Pharisee's prayer, he's effectively saying, I thank you, God, that I am such a great guy, that I am so good. What nerve and what arrogance the Pharisee must have had to think that he was owed salvation, to think that God owed him anything. And what sense of entitlement to unabashedly approach God in this manner. With reading that passage, I'm forced to think, have we ever done the same? Or thought the same? Something to think about. Continuing on in the passage, we come to the tax collector's prayer. Chapter 18 and verse 13. It says, But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. First, we see that he stood afar off. Now, what does this actually mean for us? Or how can we relate? Well, it means he didn't consider himself worthy to stand next to the lordly Pharisee or even to go into the temple. Likely that he and maybe even other tax collectors in general didn't usually come into the temple, especially because of the popular ill will against them. Probably he stood on the outer edge of the court of the Gentiles, so the very far outside portion of the temple, as to not encroach because he wasn't worthy. Why should he go further in when there are so many other people who are more worthy than he is? Because he knew who he was. He continues with, he would not even lift his eyes to heaven. Again, he knows that before God, he is nothing. He's conscious of his unworthiness, that he can barely approach God. He is assumed to be God's enemy. This is what he thought in his mind, that I am so unworthy that I cannot approach. I need to stand at the back of the room, sit on the floor, do whatever to show that I am not worthy to be even here. He continues with, he beat his breast. Now, the meaning of this is he makes an exaggerated show of sorrow, despair, or regret. It's a sign of contrition, which is the state of being remorseful and penitent. So he had an outward action. He was outwardly repentant, outwardly penitent and remorseful of what he had done. And here the tax collector speaks, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. He had God as the subject, seeing himself as a passive figure needing mercy. He was placing an appeal to God. He asked God to show mercy through atoning forgiveness, makes no comparison to others, and is concerned only with improving his own spiritual health, and knows that the only way to do so is to rely on God's mercy. A short prayer, something that we can use as an example. Now, what does this mean for us? How can we apply the passages here? Well, first we see that Jesus concludes this passage in verse 14. It says, I tell you, this man, meaning the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other, the Pharisee. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus is using this as a guide for practicing righteousness. The Jews understood that the Pharisees were righteous. They were the leaders. They were the ones out front speaking and being in charge. They were perceived as being more righteous, set apart, and the loved one of God, where the tax collector was shunned, ostracized, and moved and pushed out of Jewish culture. And see that the Pharisee sought his own justification. He believed that through his actions, through comparing himself to others and making a spectacle of his prayer, that he would be justified. You can see in Matthew 6 and verse 1, actually, if you turn to Matthew 6, we'll be there for a little bit. Matthew 6 and 1. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people. Why? Well, in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. The Pharisees wore distinct clothing. They acted distinctly. They separated themselves from everyone else in order to be seen. They were distinctively seen from a distance. And what do we see with the Pharisee in this case? He is seen with how far he goes into the temple, because presumably he went as far in as he was allowed to go and didn't hang in the back or didn't hang in the shadows, but was in the sunlight and on a box proclaiming his prayer so everyone could see. Continue to remember Jesus' command when we are giving. You know, the Pharisee said he tithed, but Jesus' command in Matthew 6, 2 through 4 says, thus, when you give to the needy, shout no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they receive their reward. But when you give to the needy, let not your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Again, what is the purpose of our actions? What is the purpose and our attitude that we are projecting? Are we wanting to be seen by others, by those in the world? Or are we wanting to be seen by God only? The Pharisee wanted to be seen by everyone around him. In the same passage, Jesus provides guidance for how we should pray. So Matthew 6 and verses 5 and 6 says, when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogue and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Again, why are we doing certain things? Why? We see that the Pharisee and the tax collector, why did he stand out and be seen? And why did the tax collector shrink to the back? Was it to be seen by men, or was it to be seen by God? Putting aside the going up to the temple as was the tradition in that time. You can see the Pharisee also exercised self-honor. Oh, see that being aware or beware of self-honor, for one day you will be asked to step down so another can step up. Seeing Jesus even stating this in Luke 14 and verses 7 through 11. So Luke 14. He told a parable to those who were invited when he noted how they chose the best places, saying to them. So they people were invited and they chose the best places. In that case, they wanted to sit up front. They wanted to sit in the prime locations. Continue to verse 8. When you are invited by another to a wedding feast, do not sit in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him. And he who invited you and him come and say to you, give place to this man. And then you begin being with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down in the lowest place, so that when he who invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, go up higher. Then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. Verse 11, for whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And he also said to him who invited him, when you give a dinner or a supper, do not ask your friends and your brothers, your relatives, nor your neighbors, lest they also invite you back and you be repaid. We're going to stop there. When you're invited someplace, Jesus is saying, don't sit up front, don't sit at the head table, because that spot may not be for you. Could you imagine going to a wedding, being as a guest, and going directly to the head table? I couldn't. But that's what this Pharisee was doing. He said, I am so good, I am so important that even though I am just someone who was invited, I need to sit at the head. I am the head. I am at the head table. That is my spot. I have earned it. Well, we see the complete opposite with the tax collector. He says, I am so lowly, I am so unworthy that I can only barely enter the gate. I am not going to sit in the back. I am going to sit on the floor or outside the door so I can still hear, but not be present. Now, for our contemporary mind, we can see that pride, in this case, it preaches merit. It preaches the things that we need to do, but also negotiates with Jesus and with God as an equal, as opposed to being lowly. Separates by putting others down because I have to push others down so I can push myself up. It destroys through alienating self-service, and it turns up its nose at others. Contrast that with humility. Humility pleads for compassion. It approaches in need, identifies with others, and recognizing we all have the same need. It opens doors with the power to sympathize with the struggles we share. Often it opens and offers an open and uplifted hand. Pride means that the task is more important than the people. The objective becomes the obstacle to human relationships. Jesus, condemned pride because it is so insidiously destructive. Where humility does not discuss itself, it simply gets out there and serves, often with sacrifice. It does not claim rights. It tries to do whatever is right. It doesn't brag about integrity. It simply displays it. One of the commentaries I read brought an illustration. It says the contemptuous tax collector might be an almost unseen deacon. A larger congregation with multiple deacons, like the one I grew up in, you may have a deacon who is unseen, constantly going back and forth, doing their assigned duties and above, but yet does it in such a manner that you don't know. Who faithfully and honestly, weekly after week, serves and never says a word about what he is doing. He will never be up front in the church, nor will he seek to be. He faithfully walks with God and relies on him. Such people are often unappreciated in the church, but God knows who they are. So bringing it together. The values that God honors are those whereby we look at ourselves in light of who he is and not through the distortion that comes from comparing others to ourselves. You've looked through the bottom of a glass Coke bottle. The world around you through that Coke bottle is distorted. That is what the Pharisee is seeing. He's seeing it through his own distorted lens. Where humility is rare in a society that loves to brag about uniqueness and merit, its negative side, it can become a manipulative way to invoke a bargaining chip. I do this, therefore I get this. Rather than approaching God on the basis of his mercy and grace, we approach him by appealing to our track record and subtly suggesting he owes us a response. That is merit. But the real danger of pride is that it blinds us to how we really stand before God. Our humility soberly looks at where we stand, never forgetting that the standard of comparison is the character of God himself. The tax collector knew where he stood as he approached God. He walked in the very back of the temple and stayed there because that's where he thought his place was. It was not a product of his own achievement, but a result of God's kindness and extending mercy. Understanding ourselves as the object of mercy breeds compassion. We do not rate ourselves more highly than we ought, nor do we suggest that God is blessed to have us at his side. The privilege is ours to know him. The attitude of humility rests on his grace. Pride is an affront to God. So which man are you? We often want to identify with the humble tax collector. That man who humbled himself, knew in his heart and acted upon his humility, but knowing that he was wrong, knowing that he needed God's mercy. But how frequently are we more likely the prideful Pharisee? Thinking that we are better than those next to us, better than those down the street, or better than those in the same congregation building that we are sitting in. Pray that we would be humble in our dealings with others, to where we humble ourselves before God. We would be remiss if we did not offer the Lord's invitation this morning. Talk about humility and pride. Well, it takes humility to come forward and to seek God's forgiveness. It takes humility to know that I cannot do it by myself. but that I need God's salvation to do so. If you find yourself with the proud Pharisee, I ask you, I beg you to realize that, to humble yourself before God, and if need be, come forward and admit your sins. If you have not humbled yourself at all, if you are still proud and arrogant like the Pharisee, we can help you. The baptistry in the water is ready. I can hear the motor churning the water right now. What delays? Let nothing delay. If you have need of the congregation, come forward now as we stand and sing the song of invitation.